short because I'm real eager to get to the next two speakers. It's so interesting to think about history and to think about decades and centuries. When I was young, I used to think, that things like Mount Vernon were way long ago. But when you think about it in chunks of 50 years or 60 years, it's not that many times ago, generations ago. And I was thinking about that this week. We had a historic event this week that happened at Grant Park in Chicago. And it's in my very recent memory what happened there in 1968. I don't know if you remember Grant Park in 1968, but for me it's like really recent, which was when the Democratic Convention was there and there was a riot instead of there being a celebration. The last time, that young progressives had any hope, if you will, in a sense. And so I was thinking, wow, 40 years, and a lot has happened, and yet it's so vivid in my memory. And I was listening to our presenter about that Mount Vernon was almost lost to us. And yet that was only about 55 years after George Washington's death. And the interconnection of stories, the Gum Springs history folks have all these pieces of stories that are connected to these other stories that go back just so recently. And talking about the families that lived here in the Sherwood area, that's still very recent in a lot of ways. And even though it's not, but how fragile it is, how quickly these stories can be lost. And I say that because the story I wrote about in this book was a story that I learned about when I came to the Mount Vernon Unitarian Church, which is up on a hill, which apparently was a part of one of these, Mason lands. I think they were owned by Mason. I'm not sure they were owned by the Sherwood families. But, and the families that had that church, the church was started in 1955. And they were almost, I think, all of the families that founded that church were people who had come to the area from someplace else. They'd come in the post-war boom. They were middle Americans, a lot of them from the University of Minnesota, and it's great stories that you hear about where they're from. And they came and they settled in, but they got interested in the history. But more importantly was what they got interested in was what was going on in the real life times of southern Fairfax County and the issues around civil rights. And those stories were told to me by the people that had lived them. And I, as a young adult, was listening to them and thought, that's interesting. And I thought it was such an old story. And of course now I realize when I was hearing those stories in the mid-'80s, they were talking about 20 years before. And here I am 20 years since. So, the sense of time is so fragile, and if we don't tell the stories and in fact then write them down, we can lose them. And the stories that they told me were about how this group of progressive religious folks had come from other places in the country and had settled to start their Unitarian church, to work for the government in the city, and they looked around them and saw what was going on in this part of Virginia, which at that point horrified them. The segregation in the schools, the lack of rights for African Americans, the inequities, the fact that people that wanted to build their beautiful communities like Toxmont and Holland Hills and all these were being built, there was this danger that if they tried to have black families move in near that next to them, that would start a white flight. And so they worked hard on the Fair Housing Act, the federal act for fair housing. But they also were very interested in the civil rights movement, and so Mount Vernon, the church, decided to host in the early 60s the Congress on Racial Equality, because they wanted a place where they could set up a training center to train people in how to do nonviolent demonstrations, how to do sit-ins, how to do demonstrations in a nonviolent way. And apparently some of the neighbors didn't like the fact that there were these folks that were coming and staying and living in this old house up there, and because they didn't have a church building at that time. It was just the old house. And actually, it was very threatening to the community, but the community decided they cared about it, and they continued to work for other civil rights issues that were coming up in the early 60s. And then the most important part is the part of the story that I wrote up that is most moving to me was the story of Judy Street, who was a college-educated but stay-at-home mom who was volunteering herself to political campaigns, to PTAs, to community organizations. And when the first two Selma marches happened for voting rights in the early 60s, and the horrific nature of that, what was going on, was becoming very apparent. The Unitarian minister, John Wells, at that time, said to his congregation, I'm going down there because I want to march in solidarity. And in fact, apparently at that time, half of the Unitarian Universalist ministers across the country that went to Selma to be with Martin Luther King and to be with the marchers. And he said, anybody who'd like to come with me, I welcome you to come with me. This is something we do. And of all the people in the congregation, the person that chose was this sort of quiet, stay-at-home mom, PTA mom. She decided she had to do it. She had to bear witness. And the story that is in her own words, she had written it up for her sons, and they gave it to me when I did her memorial service, to tell the story of how she was scared, but she had to do it. And she got on this train all by herself. She'd never traveled by herself, with just a bedroll, and went down there knowing that people had been killed, in fact, and was willing to put up with that because she cared about it enough. And it's just one of those stories that has something to do with the community of people that were settling in here, that were coming in the 50s and the 60s and caring about civil rights and social justice. Those same people then later on formed United Community Ministries, and many other things have happened in this area. But it's those stories that I think are so valuable, and I'm so appreciative to this project, and appreciative to us keeping alive, and thank you, Cora, for you keeping alive the dreams of the people that started this project. And I hope it goes on. I hope we keep collecting stories some way, because history is so important. I've been at the Virginia Room, not for myself, but my daughters were both historians, and now they're both getting graduate work in that. So it's so important. So thank you for caring.